All right, well, thank you, John, for that introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming tonight, and to the Theosophical Society for hosting me again. It's good to be back, and I'll introduce tonight's topic, achieving spiritual liberation. I want to begin with this series of images here. So, on the very right, we have famous scene from the Mahabharata, the Indian epic, where Krishna, before the great battle, recites the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna in his chariot, including the methods of yoga, what would become yoga. In the middle we have the Buddha giving his first sermon at the deer park in what is today Varanasi, to his first disciples, outlining the Four Noble Truths, among other things. And then on the very left, we have Jesus, the most Middle Eastern version of the image of Jesus that I could find, preaching, so the most historically accurate. But he's preaching about the kingdom of heaven being at hand, to triumph over the kingdom of darkness, the kingdom of the world, and talking about a new way back to the Father through him. And so what all these figures have in common is they're outlining a methodology of recognizing the weaknesses of the human condition and overcoming that and returning back to a state of union with the divine. And so great was this path that they outlined that the wisdom that they imparted was attributed to what could only be an avatar or a Buddha or a Messiah. So it's very, very important to the human race as far as these traditions are concerned, this path that they are outlining. So that was the introduction to the introduction, and now this is the introduction. So when I first got invited back to speak at the TS after my previous talk, I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about, and there's so many topics that you can talk about in terms of esoteric religion, spirituality, and occultism and all of that. But you know, there can be a lot of really abstract concepts and ideas in all of that, and it can be easy to get lost in different things and lost in the ideal, and get distracted by some things I've found, when in fact the real fundamental thing about spirituality, which John kind of hinted at earlier, was this path of returning back to the divine, of living a good life, etc. And so that's really what I wanted to talk about tonight. And when you think about what spirituality means, the spirit, it's the true essence of things, the true essence of ourselves, the true essence of lying at the heart of reality itself. And in fact, those two things being the same. But when you do explore the spiritual nature of life, one thing that you quickly come to realize is how profoundly out of touch we are with that nature, that something about how we're living today is not in accord with the ultimate nature of things. And hence the need for spiritual transformation, which many traditions describe as a process of liberation. And I think perhaps this is something that the national president of the Theosophical Society was hinting at as well when he came here a few months ago, and he was talking about the different talks that people would give at the Theosophical Society, and how the talks that he really enjoyed were the ones which gave the remedy, as he called it. And that was the language that he sort of used. So I wanted to look at what is the remedy, because I thought that was a very interesting way of phrasing things. A remedy, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is a successful way of curing an illness or dealing with a problem or difficulty. So if you apply that to the spiritual domain, you can think of an illness, if you think about medicine in holistic terms, what is the origin of most illnesses? It's some kind of disharmony between the different parts of the body or the mind, but it can also arise because of some disharmonious relationship between the individual and the world that they inhabit. And so you might say that a spiritual remedy would restore the inner harmony and the inner wholeness of the human being and their harmony with all things. And that is the problem that spirituality would address. But as I said, many of the ancient traditions referred to a different kind of metaphor for this process, one of spiritual enslavement or spiritual imprisonment in some cases, which is the state of worldliness that we find ourselves in, and liberation from that to some more transcendent way of living. And I want to just go back to this image because I want to explain a little bit more why I selected it. This is the 5 koshas from Vedic religion, very similar to the different bodies that we would be familiar with in Theosophy. You've got the physical, emotional, mental, etc. And then at the core is Atman, pure spirit. And there's certain practices in certain schools, such as the neti practice, which is stripping away the different layers of identification of what we truly are. I'm not my body, I'm not that, I'm not my mind. And then eventually you're left with this inner divinity, which is what is really going to be the focus of tonight. So I've spoken about how I'm going to be referring to yoga, to Buddhist teachings, to the teachings of Christ, but not the ones that we're familiar with in the canonical Gospels, but more of the Gnostic teachings, the more esoteric side that's been written out of history. And I'm going to look at each of them in turn and do a bit of a comparison and see if we can distill something in common that they're saying about the path back to divinity, the path of spiritual liberation. And I'll begin with yoga, which derives from what is known today as Hinduism. And basically the Hindu view of the world is that we are stuck in an endless loop of birth and rebirth into the world of phenomena, the physical world of Samsara, which is really a world of illusion, because it's a world where everything is relative, everything is kind of fractured or fragmented into separate parts, and that is in contrast to the ultimate reality of Brahman, which you might term God. It's a state of eternity, of wholeness, of indivisibility from which all else comes. But that's not the world that we live in. So we live in this world of samsara, and if you believe in reincarnation, as these traditions do, the soul jumps from body to body and is stuck in this situation of having to go from body to body. And the reason for that is because there's a false sense of self. We have a sense of self that is rooted in the material world, unlike the solution put forward by the neti practice that I mentioned a moment ago. We believe that we are the body and we believe that we are the mind. But all of those parts of us are things that are brought about as a result of experiences that we have in the world of samsara, and we accumulate karma. We have reactions to things that happen to us in the world, and so this cycle of cause and effect occurs, and we get hung up on things that happen to us and identified with things that happen to us, and that becomes our whole personality. And then we suffer because of that, because as inevitably it must be in a world where everything comes to an end, it's inherently unfulfilling. And we feel this need, we instinctively feel like we're separated from some greater reality, but nothing can seem to fulfill that in the world. which is all, it's a bit of a downer, but, there is a solution. And that is to get in touch with something that is not of the world and to have a direct experience of that. And that is what yoga seeks to do by working on karma, which I'll speak about later in the talk, but more fundamentally by looking inward and looking past all of the illusory parts of ourself that I've discussed earlier and discovering Atman and having an experience of Atman, the divine within, and becoming so absorbed in that we identify with that. It's all very mystical, but this is how the yogis describe union with divinity. And when we do that, we have a kind of a state of pure awareness. The state of consciousness or awareness is really the expression of that divinity. And as we go deeper into that, we discover the divine root of that. And then we can have an experience of pure being, which brings a perfect bliss, and that's what gets called samadhi. And once we've identified with Atman and we have worked on our karma, we can achieve what is called moksha, or liberation. So that brings me to the Buddhist schools of thought. Much like Hinduism, the cosmology is very similar. There's the world of samsara, there's rebirth into the world of illusion, and there's karma that gets generated, which keeps us kind of hooked, keeps us invested in this world of illusion, until we're able to shed the baggage of that karma. And I would argue you don't need to believe in rebirth or reincarnation to appreciate these kinds of teachings, because we just in this life there's a lot of benefit in trying to get beyond the way that we live now. But I digress. So once again, the goal is to escape the cycle of rebirth, or simply just the cycle of phenomena, you could say, in a single lifetime. But the methodology of doing that is based around the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha gave. It's framed in terms of life being a life of suffering. That's actually not quite an accurate translation of what the Buddha was saying. The word suffering, the original word that was translated into suffering, was more like dissatisfaction or a lack of fulfillment. But a lack of fulfillment in the things of the world. The source of that suffering is attachment to desires for things that inhabit this world. And there's an end to suffering which is achieved through the Noble Eightfold Path, which I'll get into the second part of this talk. So this is very much a path of renunciation. There's a big emphasis on renouncing things, shedding attachments and things like that. There's a bit more of a focus on experiencing a kind of a bliss that's associated with putting the attention onto more divine things in yoga. So it's much more of a subtractive kind of a technique, I would argue, in Buddhism. But the goal is very similar, but it's rather than merging with some kind of godhead, it's framed much more in terms of achieving a state called not self, the state of nirvana, which means to be extinguished. And so you've got this concept of the void, of pure nothingness, which is what is at the core of what we truly are, and is the ultimate reality of things in Buddhism. But again, language is a bit of a barrier here, because it's not a nothingness in terms of a vacuum, but it's much more a nothingness in terms of a lack of form, a lack of limitations. So it's more of a boundless kind of a state of infinite potential that is being described as the ultimate reality. And so in some sense you can see a bit of a connection to the Vedic idea of Brahman. Okay, so that brings me at last to Gnosticism. This one is a bit different. There's modern forms of Gnosticism. I'm going to be talking about the ancient Gnosticism that's lost to time and the way that they approach this problem. So it's much more mythological in the Gnostic framework. We have there's different schools of Gnosticism even in the first century, but more or less kind of mythological framework of there being the perfect world, the higher heavenly world of what's called the pleroma, and then below that what's called the created world, the physical world of the demiurge, which we inhabit. And the Gnostics believed that we were, at our core, divine sparks that had descended down from the pleroma and had become imprisoned in physical bodies. And that we needed to liberate the divine spark so that it could return back to the pleroma. And I don't want to give the wrong idea here. The Gnostics weren't suggesting, a solution to this that was along the lines of Heaven's Gate or something like that. It was about living life differently, living life to aspire towards one day reuniting with the pleroma and with God. And so that when the day finally comes when we leave this physical plane, we can feel satisfied that we have shed our attachment to this world and we can ascend back home. And so the way back for the Gnostics was through this path of gnosis, or self-knowledge. And the word gnosis, it translates roughly to knowledge, but it's not ordinary knowledge. It's not a book knowledge, but it's a kind of a direct experience, and not just any direct experience, but a direct experience of a transcendent reality, a divine reality. And so, of course, the foundation of that for the path back, according to the Gnostics, would be the experience of our own divine nature, that we are a divine spark, and really understanding that core teaching, and then understanding the things that are preventing us from fully emerging into living as divine creatures, rather than creatures that are still bound by the limitations of being part of the world. And the Gnostics believed that the being who provided this knowledge that liberated the human race was none other than Christ. But it wasn't the Christ of the canonical Gospels. It was a very different idea of salvation. It wasn't this kind of very superstition-steeped idea that we have, that we're familiar with, of there's a sacrifice to save people from hell and all of that sort of thing. It's more that it's the knowledge that is given that is the thing that saves. And I think that is much more profound. So I've spoken about the problem that was outlined in all of these ancient traditions, and we still see echoes of this as well in modern times. The most recent myth that kind of talks about this process in metaphorical language is the Matrix. The Matrix trilogy. I'm not so sure about number 4, but the Matrix trilogy is like a modern take on the path of spiritual liberation and the problem of the human condition and the way back. And that way back is, well, if you want to summarize it in 2 basic steps, it's rediscovering your inner divine nature and then changing the way we live to serve a higher purpose, whether you want to call that God or simply just virtue or whatever. This higher purpose, something that is fulfilling in itself, something that is good in itself, which really is really the most important aspect of the absolute reality that we're referring to when it comes to how that's relevant to human human experience and human life. But then that higher purpose that we live by supersedes the way we normally live, which is just to serve the interests of the ego, which just gets us nowhere and just continues the cycle of suffering. So there's different ways that these different traditions have outlined this path back. For the Buddhists, it's the Noble Eightfold Path. You've got here right speech, right intention, right action, right view, livelihood, and effort. That all sounds a lot like moral precepts. It sounds like living a virtuous life, adopting values that will allow us to live a life of higher purpose. And then the last two, mindfulness and concentration, well, that's really talking about meditation. The skills that we need to meditate and go within. And then in that process of going within, that's when we discover the spark of what we truly are. And that's when we have that direct experience that I was talking about before, that the Gnostics say is so crucial. And so the Gnostics as well, they had this idea of union with divinity. They described it in very cryptic, symbolic terms as the union in the bridal chamber between the bride and bridegroom, the bride representing Sophia, a being of wisdom, representing wisdom, and her counterpart, who was the Christ. So this union of opposites. And really there's a couple of different layers of meaning to that. There's, on the one hand, two things that had become separate, reuniting into a state of wholeness, which can be seen as a metaphor for the state of living in the phenomenal world, the world of karma, and then transforming our life to be feeling at one with the divine nature of things, which we really already do, because the divine is all things and it's everywhere. But we believe that we are limited to this reality. And so that's why it's described as an illusion. So it's moving away from that illusion. And also we see the union of two beings as really, you could argue, serving as a metaphor of the union of subject and object. And in this case, the subject is the human being seeking after something higher, and the object is God, and those two become united as one. The uniting of the macrocosm and the microcosm, you might say. And then the Gnostics, they have other stages in the path back, as expressed in the Gnostic Gospels and other texts that they found hidden in jars around in the Middle East, restoring this knowledge to us. One system that they discovered was in the Pistis Sophia, the repentances of the Sophia, where the divine being Sophia that I described, who, like human beings, have become trapped in the world of matter, begins her ascent back by shedding the garments, in a sense, that she had before, and then as she sheds them, putting on the garment of light instead, once she has shed that which is of the created world. And what this is really a metaphor for is this circle here, the lower aeons. You've got a bunch of different planets that represent different things. So you've got inconstancy, greed, lust, pride, wrath, injustice, deceit. These are the things that are shed by Sophia as she ascends back, the same path that humanity must follow. And so we see a shedding of vice, and of course the corollary of that is the adopting of virtues in their place. The flip side of those vices. And then the upper circle at the very top is is the pleroma, the heavenly realm that we can unite with following Sophia once we have shed the baggage put on us by the archonic realm. And of course, in Hinduism as well, we see there's actually many different yogas. But the four great yogas, according to Swami Sivananda, who was one of the great modern yogis, they were Jnana Yoga, which is the yoga of knowledge, Raja Yoga, which is the yoga of will, Bhakti Yoga, which is the yoga of love and devotion, and Karma Yoga, which is the yoga of good works. And these are all different paths pointing to the same thing. The ultimate goal is always union with the divine in this kind of experiential way. But in addition to the practices to achieve that state, these yogas invariably also have moral practices attached to them. And so, again, we have this gaining this direct experience of divinity within, coupled with moral conduct. So we can, in fact, distill some very common threads running through all of these different traditions, I would argue, and a common view on what the path back really is. And that brings me to just about the end of my talk. So we have this fundamental goal, and there's broad agreement on it. Of course, every culture is different, and there's always going to be peculiarities of a given culture or time in terms of the way things are described. But a large amount of agreement, I think, on what's wrong with the human condition and what the path of liberation, spiritual liberation, truly is. You could say that it could be considered part of the perennial philosophy as described by Aldous Huxley underlying all true religion. And so that's what has been handed down to us. It's the end goal of human destiny. It's a path that every soul must one day follow and one day reach the end of. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you, everybody.